Hi, a very good evening to you. Today we are going to discuss what is quality standard and its application in translation services. We will also understand what are linguistics as well as non-linguistic requirements for maintaining compliance with various types of quality standards applicable in translation services. Be with us. Thanks for watching and do subscribe to our channel. Today we will be covering quality standards in translation. While trying to understand quality standards in translation, I have prepared this presentation which I presented it long back at NL Mittal Institute of Technology in 2009, and luckily I was invited as a keynote speaker. So I had prepared this quality standards that applies to language marking. Earlier, since till 90s, when we talk of quality standards, it was not there in the psyche of people globally. So the explosion that has taken place in 90s, it helped in the rapid growth of language services, localization services, and these services, when they started coming into picture, there used to be mismatch of expectations between consumer. When I say consumer here, it means the client, and the service provider. That could mean translators or translation service people. So because of this mismatch, there was a conflict, many times unpleasant surprises given to the clients, many times unexpected demands imposed on translators or service providers. So this gave rise to questions that was parallelly being applied to all service industry, and that was how to develop professional standards so that this mismatch of expectations can be handled. So Germans, they have been very, very smart in initiating quality standards in translation. You might be knowing that Germany was the first one which initiated quality standard translation under a name called German Standard DIN 2345. They have been very, very smart in producing automotive industry, automobiles, and mainly translations were being deployed for translation of manuals or designs or industry specifications or technical specifications, etc., for German manufacturers who were outsourcing their works to different parts of the world. So in order to maintain consistency, they developed their own standard, and that is called DIN 2345. And variety of people participated in that, and it helped to some extent, specifically for automotive industry translation, to understand the basic requirements in translation industry. So when we talk of quality standards, certainly it refers to standardization and consistency. However, they cannot be taken as legally binding. They are somehow, I will say, that is called de facto standards, which people expect you to follow. And because of that, ISO concept has been, international standard concept has been developed. However, almost all major countries have their own quality standard body. Bureau of Indian Standards, this is called BIS, is the body in India that controls standardization of things. You might be knowing there is a concept called ISI mark. Similarly, in Japan, there is a concept called JIS. Chinese have their own standard called Chinese standards. Americans have their own standard called ASTM standards. Canada has its own standard called Canadian standards. Germany is DIN. European Union is called EN. CE marking and European Union standards. There are quite a good number of these standards applied in industry, and the same kind of concept was adapted or adopted to translation industry as well. So strictly speaking, this is not a law. However, people who adhere to those standards are expected to follow the parameters defined as per those standards. If you are, for example, ISO certified company, it is understood that you could be following certain parameters that is defined under that particular standard. For example, Modeling is ISO 9001-2008 certified company. That means all companies of the world who are ISO 9001-2008 certified will follow certain procedures of project management, data management, client services, feedback mechanism, improvement mechanism, documentation mechanism, accounts mechanism. So there are a variety of things that comes into picture of any office management, and these standards are created in order to increase the efficiency. There are very specific, highly demanding standards that demands Six Sigma. You might come across this Six Sigma thing in management that is being taught at all levels, black belt, green belt and whatnot. If you are a black belt in quality standard in Six Sigma, it's considered you are one of the best persons in quality management thing. And it has to do with know-how also. So in brief, it refers to a standardization of procedures and processes in order to increase the efficiency of a management or a process and minimize loss and help in further improvement of processes. So it's like, if you recall, I had given you a model called IDA model. In quality standard also, there are PDCI model that comes into picture. So now when we move up the ladder, the more and more things start coming into quality standard management. Luckily, I had been, a certified quality standard trainer. I underwent a training at FICCI. It is a very intensive training, and that is very useful. It teaches you how to improve your own self, your own working procedures on a daily basis. When I say improve, how you improve? You improve only when you document, only when you act, when you do errors, when you do repeat errors. But you have to have the mechanism to check all these activities that you are doing, and for that you need to document. And once you have documented, you can, after a week's time or 2 weeks time or a month's time or a 2 months time or a 6 months time, see where you are falling and where you are improving. So those parts which are improving, you need to further improve, and those parts which are
going down or not doing well, weaknesses are there, you need to improve. So you are able to identify your weaknesses as well as strength only when you document all your activities, and you have to develop a mechanism for all the activities, and it takes time. Many times you create a documentation procedure and you are not very sure what happens to your documentation. After a certain period of time, you find a gap, you fill it. Again you do some activities, you scale up something, again you feel fine, some weaknesses, again fill. So that's how you start from zero, move 2 steps, find weaknesses and strength, fill the gaps, again move, and that's how you scale up and try to improve efficiency of process. And the moment you increase the efficiency, your human resource also starts increasing. So the same whole basic concept of a standard applies to our translation industry also. I have already explained you in previous slide that how quality standard that applies in different aspects of processes of any industry or any business. It refers to methodology, number one, in linguistic concept. For example, it refers to information processing, information and documentation, and certainly we have to follow terminological principles. And those terminological principles are defined in ISO TC 37 standard. This is again another standard, that is specifically for terminology management. Similarly, the standards also refer to not only product, but they also refer to testing, they also refer to process, they also refers to interface standards and data standards. So means if you go by trying to understand what the standard means, one standard can be applied specifically for one house or one classroom or one office. It can be enlarged to a bigger office, it can be enlarged to a group of offices, it can be enlarged to a group of companies, bigger companies, and that's how the popularity and utility of those standards comes into picture. So the more acceptability of one standard is, the more important that standard becomes and more popular it becomes. So when we talk of language market now, it has quality standards has been evolving, and at the same time the translation processes have also evolved from literature based to administrative, from administrative to commercial, from commercial to IT, from IT to artificial intelligence, and to kind of changing the memory of the person. The next stage is going to come when you will have to just insert kind of drive into your brain and you start talking in Japanese or Chinese or Korean or whatever. I mean, earlier we were putting floppy in hard disk, Now scientists have already developed certain chips that can be inserted into brain, and that brain makes interface with that chip, and you are totally your hard disk has improved, your brain function, your brain starts functioning like anything. A time will come when there are lots of things that will happen, and language has plays important role in all these developments. So when we are talking about variety of quality standards, as the translations has evolved and the processes have also evolved, translations standards have also evolved. So I had talked to you about DIN standard before. There are some popular standards that applies in translation, and that is American standard. Then they have developed Society of Automotive Engineers SAE standards, then European Union standards 15038, this is called EN 15038, LISA standards, and so on. The most recent one is ISO standard. There is a misconception, about translation, and that misconception is language is something, which does not have norms. When I say norms, in the sense, our brain functions in such a way that one word can be expressed in 100 forms, or one concept can be expressed in 100 ways. But now the fundamentals are, when we talk of technical translation, or when we talk of commercial translation, or when we talk of legal translation, experts practically have given meaning not to term but to one concept. Means for one concept there is one term. So that means when there is one term, there is one concept, or when there is one concept, there is one term. That means there is no point of deviation. If you are defining one concept and that has one term, second or third or fourth term will be supporting term. But one concept will have only one primary term. So the focus will be, if one standards are defined that for this particular concept we will use this particular term, that means a language can be developed into a standardized form. And that is the reason why these concepts are applied in terminology management. So translation standards are directly linked to terminology management as well. And that terminology management happens for a particular company, for a particular industry, for a particular industry within a country, or it can go into outside country as well. Similarly, for example, a term expressed in French in France and a term expressed in French in Canada, they can vary. So this variation can be minimized by putting them into or linking them with standards. If in the automotive industry of Canada and automotive industry of France agree that for this particular term we will only use this particular word, or for this particular concept we will only use this particular term, then it becomes a standardized standard globally. If you deviate, that means you are doing errors. So in translation, when people say your translation is not good, or your translation is bad, or your translation is not acceptable, etc., etc., they can't say anything unless and until there is a reference point. Without reference point, I can always claim that my translation is the best, or client can always claim that your translation is the worst, because they don't want to pay you. That means if translators feel their own way and client feel their own way, then they will not be ever in talking terms. So how they come into talking terms? They come into talking terms when both sit together and define what terminology to be used, what process to be followed, what words to be avoided, what fonts to be used, what spacing to be used, what is the size of the font. So apart from linguistics, there are a large number of activities that comes into picture which are non-linguistics in translation, especially when we are talking about technical and commercial translation. So we will see how those points come into picture, but meanwhile there are certain misconceptions also, assumptions. If we are giving good quality standards, that means we are putting large efforts, high efforts, that means the translator is very good, is smart enough, and by applying all these quality standard processes, you have right to increase the cost of the project, or you can demand more price. I believe this is a wrong standard because, or wrong assumption, because quality standards are applied for increasing your efficiency, for increasing efficiency of the process, for delivering a flawless work to the client. So that is where the quality standards comes into picture. So when applying quality standards is helping you speed up your work, is helping you minimize your risk of bad quality, it is helping you maintain consistency through using a terminology that has been supplied and vetted by the client to you. So then there is no point making additional cost to it, because it's a win-win situation for you as well as for the client. So that is why people, when talk of quality standards, they start adding 10% or 20% premium. I mean, you as a translator, you can certainly try and sell it as your USP and add value to it and ask for more money smartly. But the practicality is, if you are using quality standards and deploying it in your process, you are helping your own self, not the client. Certainly, client will have the end result, but in reality, it is helping our translators. So when I had not talked too much to you about quality standards, but it also comes into picture into project management. The first funda of project management is, if you are dealing with a large number of text, and if you are dealing with a client with whom you have intentions to develop long-term relationship, and client is also expecting you to develop long-term relationship, the first thing that you must do is start preparing a glossary of the terms. Suppose I receive 10 pages today from the client. The first thing I should do is prepare a list of 100 words, keywords of that particular project. Prepare his glossary and meaning. Send it to the client and say that, sir, this is what we have received, and these are the certain keywords that has come into our notice, and we believe that this should be how we will be using it. If you have some expert in your office or a terminologist sitting in your office, why don't you help us by vetting this terminology? And once that vetting is done, you have created a reference point. Client then after can't refuse, and tell you that you have done a bad translation. Why? Because client himself has approved your glossary. And if you have religiously followed 100% that glossary which has been vetted by the client, if client refuses it, you can legally sue that client and demand not only your salary or your remuneration, but a damage as well. I mean, because that particular client has then become legally binding, to honor the contract in which you have entered in. There are people around, especially in translation business, who play smart with translators. They try to get their work done without putting efforts, and they expect you to do miracles. And that miracle cannot happen unless and until I also cooperate with you. You cannot bring a mason in your house and say that prepare a building for me. For preparing a building, you need an architecture who will give you the map, and you will need mechanical people who will tell you the specifications of iron rods, etc., which kind of cement, which kind of balu, etc. has to be applied, and then the mistri comes and then prepares the building for you under your supervision. For each and everything, that person comes and consults you. So if client starts telling you, no, I am not available, just do miracle to me, it is better to leave that client and not do the work at all, because you are working in a danger zone. So this is a 1 minute advice to you. If you are dealing with such kind of clients, it's better not to deal. because at the end of the day what you will get is not the money but the prestation. So now let's move on to the next point, and that is, Society of Automotive Engineers was very smart enough. They created certain, linguistic standards, and that was these 7 parameters. The first one is wrong term. Don't use wrong term. When your translation is using wrong terms, you are gone. Syntactic errors, omissions. Many times in translation we miss something. Word structure or agreement, it is not correct. Misspelling, punctuation error, and miscellaneous errors. With these 7 basic things, they were able to infuse a sense of professionalism among translators. I mean, this was a turning point in translation industry when somebody, a client or a standard, is guiding you and telling you that while doing translation, the minimum that you could not do or minimum that you should follow is follow these 7 standards, and that is related to linguistics. However, when we are talking about, CAD tools or machine tools, etc., etc., either you use MemoQ or you use smart tools or you use Trados or WordFast or whatnot, all of these people have included certain non-linguistic aspects into translation, and that is segment level check. Many times segments, they tell you what is forgotten translation. Machine will tell you, that you have forgotten to translate this particular line. Incomplete translation, corrupt characters, many times because of portability of file from one point to another, some corrupt characters comes into picture, or your document will have something absurd showing. There are many times, when because of comma or because of double full stop or breaking of full stop, there is inconsistent sentence count. Similarly, there is inconsistency where in source and target both. So target language has 10 sentences and source has 11. So there is one sentence which has got lost somewhere. Similarly, punctuation, spaces, double spacing, double dots, double punctuation, quotation marks, brackets, parentheses, numbering, number formatting, measurement units. For example, client has supplied you with units in mile and you are doing in translation in kilometers. They are talking in terms of feet and you are talking in terms of meter. Similarly, terminology, project glossaries, adherence, identical, untranslatable. There are lots of words which are not translatable, So instead of we deliberately translate that, there are lots of tags that has to be maintained the way it is, because those tags get converted into pictures, when they take their original shape. So there are many identical tags that has to be supplied, especially when you are using, Trados or Workbench. You have to use this. If you miss a tag, that is one of the grave errors. You cannot go and claim that your translation was very good and it was lots of people write in their biodata, I do a flawless translation. But this is foolishness. There is nothing called flawless translation, especially when we are talking about commercial or technical and legal translation. Flawless translation comes when you are dealing with literature, and literature market is hardly 3% of the global market, translation market. I mean, just for 3% of market size, 97% of market size has been ignored by just writing flawless translator. Similarly, there are a variety of definitions that comes into picture about translation, quality standards in translation. For example, I have been, kind of dealing with variety of people globally. Jerry Stretchkal was president of American Translators Association. I was interacting with him when I was elected member of International Federation of Translators council member, and he was also a council member and vice president of the association. So American Translators Association has been very active in promoting translation standards certification as well. So for him it says it is a concept of quality plagued with same problem as the concept of translation. It is a mixed bag with enormous spread between creative and normative. Means you need to be creative and at the same time you need to be following the norms as well. Somebody may say, I have translated Don Quixote. In Spanish it's called Don Quixote. For example, Edith Grossman's translation, is a very good translation. If we go and tell him, Edith, that you follow the quality standards, then it will be foolishness, because in literature, when there is a more of value for creativity and less value for norms, we cannot mix quality standards in trying to translate, books of Premchand or trying to translate books of Ramdhari Siddhinkar or poems of Harivansh Rai Bachchan, where we do not go and put, Society for Automotive Engineers standards or quality metrics there. There we put the creativity of the translator.